to the cloud. Wonderful. Welcome, everyone. Welcome on this Wednesday evening in March. Thank you so much to Sharon for making this event possible. Thank you to St. Mary's and the Center for Women, Gender, and Equity. And thank you so much to my team here in the community engagement class and to our wonderful speakers. Before we start, I'm going to just ask everyone to just take a real big deep breath in as we center ourselves and just locate where we are in whatever space we're at. Yeah, if any of you are like me, I've been running around all day, so this is a good moment of pause. And we're about to get into some real good and juicy conversation here. So to begin everything, I'm actually going to pass this along to Colin, who's going to talk to us a little bit about some Brave Space guidelines as we enter this conversation.
Thank you, Mariska. So hello, everyone. My name is Colin. And before we go into our conversation on cancel culture, we wanted to take the time to go over our Brave Space guidelines. If you already know it, I'll go through them and list them off. And if you have any questions after, if you have any clarification points or questions about what each one is, I would be glad to answer those for you. So the first one is controversy with civility. And the next one is own your intentions and impacts. The next will be challenged by choice. The next one will be no attacks. And our last point will be respect. Is there any clarification needed? Nope. Okay. I'll pass it right back to you, Mariska.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Mariska Keysbury. I am a junior transfer coming in. This is my first year at St. Mary's, ethnic studies major. And I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to give an introduction to each of these people, our wonderful guests this evening. Yeah, and then also guests, when it's on your turn, if you could also just clarify what pronouns you use as well, that would be great. So today in the room, we have Paula Khan. Paula is a migrant justice social worker, consent and anti-oppression educator, and conflict transformation mediator. They designed and implemented consent, anti-oppression, and decolonizing organizing, accomplices not allies pedagogy for the Berkeley Student Cooperative, Code Pink, and Freedom for Migrants. Paula is currently pursuing their MPH at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Thank you, Paula, for being here. We also have Tessa Vida Levine, who is a depth and somatic-oriented psychotherapist interested in supporting collective liberation. Her work with individuals, groups, and systems is informed by an understanding of systemic oppression and intergenerational trauma. Tessa spent her first career as an activist and organizer in the progressive movement, from unions to migrant reform to climate justice and everywhere in between. She then completed her master's thesis on archetypal expressions of white supremacy and the cultural complex of white innocence. And our other panelist this evening is Isak Ali, who has a history of working in public policy and business development focused on regulatory compliance, quantitative research, and market expansion in the cannabis industry. Isak is most recently turned his focus towards social impact and social equity in the hemp and cannabis spaces by helping launch, manage, and grow the Momentum Cannabis Business Accelerator at Ease and co-founding Halal Hemp, a global initiative to bring hemp and cannabis medicine to the greater Muslim community. Thank y'all for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, let me know, is there anything else that you'd like to share about yourselves that I didn't catch in that formal introduction? Wonderful. So with all of that, I'd love to just jump into this big conversation about cancel culture, and was wondering if y'all could start by letting us know, what does cancel culture mean to you?
Who wants to start? Go ahead. Cool. So I'll just give you guys, y'all a little bit of background. So my name's Isak Ali. I use he, him, his pronouns. Um, as Mariska had mentioned, I come from like the cannabis industry and the cannabis space, working for one of the largest cannabis businesses in California previously. Um, which really emerged during a time of when like the cannabis space was really became a thing and became an industry based on the back and the hard work of a lot of advocates, particularly here in the Bay Area, and particularly LGBTQ plus advocates out here. And so it was seen as this sort of like very edgy, sort of tech bro-y business coming in and taking over this industry that was started by a lot of marginalized folks. And so when I started, a lot of the people at the business were really starting to be very sort of mindful of that and understanding of that. And so I ended up moving into this sort of more social impact focused space where I really got to be kind of like the conscious of the business and really sort of filter in and out what the communications were, how they sort of behaved out in the community, and just the way that they really portrayed themselves. Um, and so in a lot of cases, the way that we sort of justified the work that we did and really talked about the community impact work that we did and the value of it, we had to communicate it in the terms of things like cancel culture to the board and sort of the executives at the company in order for them to understand what we were talking about. Because cancel culture became this sort of buzzword that a lot of people saw as like this negative thing that happens to like businesses and famous people when they kind of step out of line. And so for me, I was really able to approach it from almost this sort of corporate point of view where you literally use this as a justification point for why you do a lot of the good things that you do. But in a lot of ways, you can also leverage that in saying like, in order not to be canceled, like you got to do some really cool work and some really cool projects. And so just wanted to share that like, there's a lot of ways and that cancel culture, I think, has sort of pushed things in the right way, but also kind of helped inform the way that a lot of people step out and show up in the world, not just on a personal point of view, but from like also a corporate like point of view as well.
Thank you for sharing, Isak. And pass it on over to Paula.
Hey everyone, great to be here with you today. So when I think of cancel culture, I think it's dynamic. I can't really think of a single definition, nor do I want it to be singular. I think there can be many associations depending on the context. And I'm just thinking about like, just from listening to Isak, just thinking about boycotts, boycotts come to mind, or, when an artist or someone who has a big following says something that is harmful or does something that is harmful, there, may be a call to cancel such a figure. So I think it's like divesting attention or divestment from a relationship. I think divestment is helpful to think about it. But I think depending on whether someone is in the position of being held accountable or perhaps is in the role of holding someone or an entity accountable, cancel culture might be perceived differently. So I think it just really depends where someone is in the set of circumstances. I think cancel culture, there are certain risks of cancel culture not having any safeguards when call-ins or call-outs happen. So I do think that's something that needs to be factored in and taken into consideration, or, when grievances are expressed openly, what is the follow-up there? Sometimes, observations I've made is that there may not be follow-up, but, then there's also the counterpoint that sometimes follow-up is not what is needed. So again, it's super contextual, super dynamic. I also want to question the term cancel culture. I do think that there's other language that could be used. So I guess I'd love to hear more about what we think of what we associate with the term cancel. When is it appropriate? When is it not appropriate? Because I do think cancel also implies disposability. So I don't know, it's interesting. I think it can definitely be taken to the extreme. So yeah, I think it's definitely dynamic. Yeah, I'll pause there.
Thank you so much for speaking to both the expansiveness and fluidness of it, as well as its dynamicism. How about you, Tessa?
Thanks, Mariska, and thank you, Isaac and Paula. It's so nice to be here with you both. Yeah, when I think of cancel culture, I primarily think of, and I totally agree with Paula, that it's dynamic and contextual, and there are words that are used to describe a lot of different things. The two things that I primarily think of are one, which I think, so coming from a political background, oftentimes, and I think especially in the kind of mid-2000s, including now, cancel culture emerged, I think, speaking to what Paula was saying, as a form of divestment from institutions and public figures that have power, and a way of, the populace and people using their choice of who they want to be listening to or interacting with or whatever to be powerful, which I think was then kind of described by right-wing politicians and centralized media as canceling people, as a way of kind of devaluing that collective power building that was happening. And so I actually don't think that that is cancel culture. I actually think that that is people using collective power. I think that cancel culture, as we think about it today, is more often something that, in my opinion, happens within communities as an expression of our internalized prison system and what Paula was saying, our internalized feelings that people are disposable. And to me, that's the type of cancel culture that feels problematic and that most often causes harm, because it's happening within more equal types of power and being used more aligned with kind of purity culture, or like if people don't say and do the exact things that they're supposed to say and do, then they're not allowed to be in community or have friends or have jobs or have anything like that. So to me, cancel culture is a big umbrella term that's used both incorrectly to describe people using collective power, and also I think is used correctly to describe the ways that our kind of internalized feelings around people being disposable come out in more hierarchical relational structures within communities. When I think what people are really like aiming for and wanting is usually something closer to accountability, or something closer to relationship. But I think that I've seen it, and I believe that oftentimes it comes out more sideways and more of a kind of attack and conflict and disposing of people. So those are the two things that I think of when I think of cancel culture.
Thank you, Tessa, so much for your perspective, and specifically for naming, how there's a form of collective power that happens in it, and also the internalized prison system that lives within us and how that can manifest through society. And I'm just thinking to all three, like, wow, thank you so much for all of your perspectives. This is going to be wonderful going deeper into it. So with that, I'm wondering if any of you could share an experience where you have been on either side of cancel culture.
Yeah, I'm happy to share some of the experiences, like just like some of the corporate level stuff that I was doing. As I had mentioned before, like there's a lot of cases where businesses like the one that I worked at, and just in many cases have to be very careful and very understanding of how they step in and show up in a lot of different places. And when I started really focusing on the sort of social impact work that we were doing, it was because a lot of people were really starting to talk about the fact that big cannabis is something that's taking over from a lot of these small businesses. And it became really present in places like the press and the media and Twitter. And even though it wasn't like specifically calling out our business, it was one of those things that was becoming very, very present and known out there. And so like, like when you think about corporate social responsibility and social impact work that a lot of companies are doing, the way that it's usually described is that you're kind of like building a moat around you, like a protection of the sort of good work that you're doing to the community, with the community, the sort of things the charity work that you're working in and contributing to. And so like, even though we never really hit the point of where the business was ever hitting like the sort of term of being canceled, but it was because like literally for years and years, we were consistently monitoring like how people were talking about the industry, the business, our own business, and like what they were looking for. Like, for example, like one of the things that was really needed in the cannabis space was like some sort of program that was going to impact underrepresented founders in the space. And so like we were able to kind of extract those sorts of conversations and thoughts that people were having out in the community and like build out something that was really cool and really important. But again, in a lot of cases, it's because we're really focusing on this level of this sort of cancel culture that became present in what like up to the level of like corporate and executive people were seeing. And so you always had to communicate that to them. And yeah, I think that was where I was going with that. But I would actually say this, that like one of the things that we were doing was really sort of trying to inspire what other businesses could do, because as you could start seeing businesses that were actually getting quote canceled in this space, like the MedMens of the world or like these other sort of big box cannabis companies, like you started seeing them adopting the sort of programming that we were creating because they were trying to prevent that sort of cancellation again by building that moat around them.
Can I jump in? Yeah, and Isak, I feel like what you're speaking to me is like the type of cancel culture that actually has a positive impact, because it's like what you said, it's like these big box cannabis things were actually being pressured through collective power. So number one, tight. Thank you for sharing that. And on the other side, where I was in a parallel experience, in like a parallel role, neither being canceled nor canceling, I had a friend who was canceled last year in a shared political movement that they and I share. And I had the most fascinating experience of this because they're part of a kind of parallel political world that I don't really consider myself a part of. And so they reached out to me to let me know that they were going through this really hard time, that they'd been accused of this thing, that they were experiencing this really public, kind of, in my opinion, violent social media campaign to have them lose their job and have them lose their community and have them lose all these things. I heard their take on what it was that had happened. And to me, in my understanding of dynamics, it did not feel like a cut and dry situation. But I was working for a political organization at the time. And one of my colleagues at the political organization went through this mutual friends, Facebook friends, and sent a group email to everyone who worked at my organization saying, hey, I've noticed that you're in relationship or in friendship or a Facebook friend of this person. I want to let you know that they are a perpetrator and that you should distance yourself from them as much as possible. They didn't know that this was actually a human that I knew and that I had been in conversation with and that had reached out to me for support. And so I reached back out to my colleague and said, hey, I actually have been talking to this person and I have a different opinion, and I'm wondering if you would be open to having a conversation, because I actually think it's really inappropriate that you emailed this to me and to all of our colleagues. And what they said was, I've been asked to not hear any other perspectives so that I can just support the person who says that they've been harmed. And to me, that is like really and everyone gets to do whatever they want to do. It's totally fine for people to not want to hear what other things are saying. But to me, to be reaching out, campaigning for the erasure and the kind of disposability of a human without being willing to actually engage with the reality of the complexity of the situation and to let that be okay in a movement that is conceptually aimed towards liberation and justice and like building the world that we believe is possible, which is the values that this colleague and I shared. And I believe that they share that with me. I totally believe that their heart is in the place of wanting to actually live in this world that we are walking towards. But I was like, yo, that's like wild and like so inappropriate. And like, to me, that's like a big example of the type of attitude that says we can't engage with nuance and complexity because we have to believe survivors. To me, that's a total disservice to anyone who's ever actually experienced abuse and harm. Like, because the world is so complex and nuanced, and if we're willing to let go of that, and not that every single person, I know I'm monologuing, so I'll wrap it up in a second, but like, not that every single person has to engage with nuance, right? If you're feeling harm and impact, great, like you don't need that necessarily in this moment. Like people should be able to take care of themselves and their communities the way that they need to. But there was something in that just really didn't sit right with me.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and sorry, I was gonna just like co-sign on that I think like what a lot of people see as cancel culture is this sort of lack of nuance reaction to something. And I just want to kind of like agree with that piece. Sorry, go ahead, Paula.
Yeah. So I have been intimately involved in a cancellation incident, but I don't really want to go into it at the moment. So just naming that, don't want to go into that rabbit hole, but it was harmful for the community that I belong to, and had to redirect my attention and my energy to heal, but it was also an opportunity to learn. And we'll just say that that happened at the height of the uprisings in 2020 in response to extrajudicial violence towards Black community members, and also during the beginning of the pandemic. So just also factoring in like what happens when the stakes are high, when there's a health crisis, when there is a crisis of state violence, what safeguards do we have in place to not, give up on each other when things get hard, but rather create opportunities to go in deeper and raise the bar for how we can transform when appropriate, to transform alongside each other or to support each other's transformation processes. But I will share like some observations I've made in the past couple of years, just also wanting to name the campaign to cancel Patrisse Cullors-Khan was something that I thought was really inappropriate and happened, I think, in the past year and a half. For those who don't know who Patrisse Cullors-Khan is, she is one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement and has done extensive community organizing work in Los Angeles County and Los Angeles City to hold the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department accountable, Los Angeles Police Department accountable, has co-founded multiple coalitions and organizations to set up civilian oversight commissions, et cetera, et cetera. And just really, as someone in the LA abolitionist organizing community, it was devastating to see, just all of the turmoil that created, a lot of also just people talking, gossiping. And I do want to name, the role of gossip and how toxic that can be when calling in and calling out happens. So I think that's also something that is important for community members to be mindful of. Like, is this healthy dialogue? Is this generative to conflict resolution? Is this solution-oriented dialogue about community members, or is this harmful gossip? Because I do think harmful gossip can play a role in call-out culture. Something else I've observed, there have been moments where like people will inform me that I'm following someone that has been, maybe has caused harm through abuse, X, Y, and Z. So there are some community members that are very diligent in reaching out to community members that might be like connected through social media ties to people who have caused harm. I've also observed people calling people out in Instagram stories, Facebook posts, and I think these are all examples of how accountability can happen. And yeah, I have seen that in the nightlife community, which is also, I think it's really important, especially if like someone has a lot of social capital. So I think, yeah, these processes, they merit dialogue, right? So I think it's a process that opens up opportunities to ask questions like, what's okay for you to share? Can I learn more about why this person is being called out? I think that has happened sometimes for me when people reach out to me and it's like maybe a high profile person who is known for their social justice work. And I'm, surprised that they are toxic or problematic or X, Y, and Z. So I do want to learn more when someone says that to me. I think it is a healthy practice to ask what happened. Why are you sharing this with me? Because I do think it's also important to remember that COINTELPRO thrived off of pitting people against each other during anti-war liberation movements, third world liberation movements. So I think that was an interesting facet of how movements were burning out and how a lot of conflict was coming to the surface in 2020. So I do ask myself, had we had some more safeguards in place to move through conflict, could we have protected each other, kept each other safe, cared for each other from burning out from all the conflicts that emerged, and how to respond to conflict in a healthy way. I'll pause there.
Paula, you've touched on a couple of elements that I'll be asking in this next question I've been thinking about a lot, which is, how have y'all seen, what have you seen in your communities as the long and or short-term impacts of living within cancel culture?
I think one of the short-term impacts, as Paula kind of pointed out, was like this, for example, in this attempt to cancel Patrisse Cullors-Khan, it's a result of the lack of nuance that became acceptable from like previous bad faith uses of cancel culture, which is what really gets spotlighted like in the media or in a lot of different places when people are trying to talk bad about cancel culture. Because I mean, to be honest, when you first reached out to me about cancel culture, like the immediate thing is this sort of like negative perception of it, even though my own experience of it is how to push things in the right direction with like large sort of systems. But like the immediate reaction is this sort of negative, like kind of like, ugh, to like, oh, I don't like cancel culture, because everyone thinks about themselves being canceled. And like, why would they be canceled? Probably because of a lack of nuance. And like, so the immediate response that ends up happening is this sort of like overreaction to try and cancel everyone, which means like the people who should be canceled might be protected by the fact that this lack of nuance has made like other forms of cancellation acceptable, which muddies the water for everything, and like really forces people to kind of have to pause. And I think like the fact that we're having this conversation is kind of because we've hit that point where like it's time for people to pause and reassess, like, what does that actually mean? Like, what are the actual effects of this? And then in terms of the long-term effects of it, like I really think about when you like zoom out a little bit more to like public policy, like you're starting to see movements of people that are trying to overturn laws that were decided like 50, 60 plus years ago when it comes to like overturning like abortion laws and things like that. And I feel like that is the other side of cancel culture that isn't really talked about, but has kind of also become acceptable, that like people can come out and say like, I don't like this, so we have to codify it into law that it can't be done. And I feel like that's kind of like the long-term effect of this acceptability of like quickly rejecting ideas without any sort of nuanced conversation.
Yeah, I feel like what one of the things that you're speaking to, Isak, is like purity culture, which I mentioned in the first thing that I said, which and I see it both ways. Well, number one, I feel like we're using the word to describe different things. I don't think anyone should be canceled. I personally don't think that there's anyone that falls under that category, although I do believe in accountability and collective power. But yeah, I feel like one of the long-term impacts, or one of the, I guess we're not even in the long-term. Yeah, and can I define purity culture? I would define purity culture as our collective and individual internalization and manifestation of, honestly, like the reverberations of Catholicism and like toxic Catholicism as it's been in the United States and through colonization. And so that and then on kind of a more depth psychological level, the impact of that is the repression of many parts of ourselves and the kind of not allowedness or dirtiness or pushing away of many of the aspects of things that make us human. So I think purity culture is this collective delusion that there is such a thing as something untainted and that we should strive for that. And I think that cancel culture in the medium, or because I don't even know if we're in long-term impact yet, but like in the medium term or in the now, I feel that cancel culture is supporting lots of people in pushing even more parts of themselves away and pretending that they don't have complicated feelings about things, pretending that it is not painful to erase community members because they've caused harm, pretending that we're just okay with that and it doesn't have this like deep impact, because not only do we see ourselves in that and like, oh, if that person is disposable, so am I, but also because that's not how humans are like built. Humans are built to care about each other, in my opinion. And so I think that shows up both in communities where people are afraid to actually speak their truth because they're afraid that if the truth that they speak isn't aligned with what the collective says they should be saying, then they'll lose access to their community. And then I also think that it comes on an internalized level of people self-policing their own emotional experience and their own actual like experience of their life, where they're not actually even to themselves able to be honest. So I think that it mostly is just like reducing our collective and individual capacity for honesty.
I'm feeling
I
a
just-
lot. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Just piggybacking off of that, yeah, I was also reflecting on how cancel culture reinforces policing within communities, of how one should behave and when one makes potentially a mistake or there's intentional harm, there's also unintentional harm. So I think it's important to distinguish both from each other. So yeah, I think when we if we identify as abolitionists, it's important, it's valuable to be self-reflective over whether one's behavior is mimicking, reinforcing the system that one is trying to abolish. And just that topic of self-surveillance, if community members witness someone get canceled, I think it can create this ripple effect of kind of people maybe, yeah, self-censoring, not being totally free to express themselves, or perhaps being excessively judgmental towards oneself and towards others when they say something. So I think there's tools to move around these things in ways that empower us to communicate when harm happens, especially in public spaces, in communal spaces. I'm a fan of the ouch oops. If folks are familiar with the ouch oops, vocalizing when something someone said or did in a collective space feels harmful. It's in between a call in and a call out because it's public. and one can choose to follow up in the moment or later. But yeah, I would say that cancel culture has weakened movements, has also ruptured communities, and it's hard to say whether there will be recovery in every community and every movement. So yeah, I think people are still on their trajectories of healing from different waves of cancel culture.
Thanks, Paula, for
Okay.
rounding out. Oh, go ahead, Tessa.
Thank you for that, Paula. And yeah, and I just want to add one more thing that is like also participating. So like there's like cancel culture and the impact that I think we were just talking about, and then like the individual impact of participating in a cancellation and in that act of violence, and then also the personal impact of being canceled has like real devastating, like people kill themselves, you know, like, and so also wanting to just name that, where like loss of community and the edges to which cancellation can push a situation wherein there's this like overwhelming belief that someone doesn't deserve access to housing or community or a job or these like really basic parts of being a person, has and does have super deadly consequences, which then also can have really devastating consequences for people who participate in cancellation and then have to like be with themselves in terms of what it means to be complicit or like an active participant in that form of violence. So also just wanting to name that piece.
Thank you, Tessa, for naming that piece. And also, you know, I think it keeps coming back to community where, you know, you've named that humans are built to care about each other. And here we're supposed to hold each other in community, but also seeing what can happen when community turns on you and the impacts and harshness of that. You all have kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm gonna, you know, see if we can do a little bit of a deeper dive around how the systems that we live in today play into these dynamics that we're talking about within cancel culture.
I think just kind of bringing back up what I talked about when it comes to like policy work and like the policies that are being implemented like across the country. Like it's not just like anti-abortion laws that are starting to pop up. It's like anti-voting laws and anti-gender affirming laws that are really starting to pop up. And like that is the real system that we're working in. Like when we're talking about a lot of these systems that have like actual impact on people, like Twitter is annoying and like Twitter cancellation is pretty real. Like when you get doxxed on Twitter, like things can happen. But like long term, like the system of Twitter isn't going to like actively harm an individual. And I think like as these things get codified into law, like it actually actively becomes a part of the system. And even though like we're not talking about like codifying cancellation in itself, but like essentially like moving into this space where there doesn't need to be a debate anymore. Like we don't, like people are saying like, oh, well, this was talked about 50 years ago. So we already debated it. We still feel this way. We still feel like it needs to be canceled. Like you see this in prohibition laws. Like you can see it in so many different aspects of like the current system that we live in. And I feel like a lot of people are being distracted by the Twitter cancel culture, not really focusing on like the larger systems and how this plays into it. And so long term, again, kind of like stepping back into that is like, what is actually going to be affecting people's lives and what cancellation is really going to affect people's lives? And I totally agree with both what Tessa and Paolo are saying is like on the micro level, like the community impact is also very real, but you always have to also look at like, what is the greater impact that's also happening? Because what's happening at the micro is kind of what allows for the macro to happen and like that sort of system to move forward. So I think it's a really important place for people to start, I think, trying to redefine what it looks like and redefine what cancel culture. And honestly, it needs to be, that term just needs to be done away with. Like people need to start separating it out into what it is, like Twitter call out, policy, like whatever craziness, like these sorts of things. But people need to vocalize it. Like we see this sort of like change in policy as like a cancellation of our rights and like things like that. And so there's ways for people to, I think, flip the narrative for the positive and be able to push it in a way that I think long-term benefits everybody. So be politically active, pay attention to those laws that are passing around you.
Paula, do you want to go? I feel like we fell into a speaking order that we don't need to stay in.
I'm good. I feel like I've answered this question in previous responses. Thanks.
Word. And I think that I feel like you're bringing such like a ray of sunshine to the conversation, Isa, with your perspective, and I appreciate it. Yeah, I think the thing that I would say about that is on the from the micro to the macro, like culturally, we consider people to be disposable. Like we consider entire communities to be disposable. We consider individuals to be disposable. Like we do not value, we consider the earth to be disposable. Like we do not actually value life and interconnectedness in dominant, like white supremacist capitalist culture. And so I think that that is the most fundamental kind of way that our systems play into this, which is that it's a mirror. It's a microcosm of the larger system that is at play, in which people don't matter and connection doesn't matter and relationship doesn't matter.
Yeah, I feel like all of y'all have just been like continuously hitting on so many of these points that I was thinking of as we were talking as I was going through these processes with Colin and Sophia, particularly around the nuance of it. And Isak, I appreciate the framework of, not just seeing it within the community and on the individual level, but understanding that it also impacts us systemically and then is being put into place with policy as well. And we're also seeing, as you named, it can be a force, when we see that collective power, it can be a force for good change as well. I am going to kind of just round us out with some last questions. I think all of y'all have answered this already. So if you feel like you want to answer it, go ahead. If not, we can go into the second part of the question. But, I wanted to ask, is there anything that you feel like we lose when we live in cancel culture? And the other part is, how do we live in a society with dualities and juxtaposing ideas?
I think, like, as we had mentioned before, like we lose this idea of nuance in conversation, but I also think we lose this idea of redeemability in a person. Like if you're canceling someone, you're acting as if like they, as Tess had mentioned, like they're losing access to housing, to jobs, to things like that. But like, to what extent, if you're actually trying to change people, like canceling someone, cutting them out isn't going to change them. It might make them double down in the problematic behavior that is getting them canceled in the first place. And I feel like you lose this ability to have an actual honest discourse and conversation. And that I think is one of the like longer term problems that we're dealing with. And like to answer your second part of your question is like people just need to be able to talk to each other a little bit more instead of just not like being willing to cut people out so quickly. Like you can have a conversation, you can disagree with people and have a conversation. Like a lot of people I think are so quickly, and this is just a result of, as you can see in studies with like social media, like causing people to just be more angry and more like quick to judgment and quick to react. Like people need to like realize that they need to sometimes temper that sort of immediateness that they're used to from social media, and like this need to just like, oh, if I don't want to talk to them, I can block them or delete them. But you can't really do that in real life. Like even if you cancel someone on Twitter, like let's say you still have to see them in person, like they're still a human being. And just personally in my experiences, just seeing how it works, like I feel like you can get a lot more out of a person when you actually like say like, hey, we're calling you out, but also here's what we would want to see out of you to like redeem the situation. And I feel like the idea of cancel culture that we've been talking about like kind of cuts out that second half of it. Like it doesn't allow for like the actual conversation that needs to actually be had. So I think it's really important for people to just start talking more in person and like showing up, not just being active on Twitter Twitter or on Facebook or on Instagram. And you see that a lot with political activism also. Like people will be active on social media, but won't actually do anything in person. And it's important to still have that sort of in-person aspect to make sure that people still realize that we're human. We have to live on this earth together. And I think it's really important for people to just like, you can disagree and have a conversation. We just need to like kind of like remind ourselves that you don't have to agree with everybody. Like the algorithm has put us in a bubble that we're surrounded by only things that we want to see. And like people need to understand that, yes, sometimes it's important to like shelter yourself from what's out there when you need to be protected, when you need to be in your feelings and kind of need to understand what you're going through, but you also have to be able to like react to the nuance of the world like around you. So just a, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to follow that thread. So yeah, I really do think I think it's dynamic, right? Because I think that it is valuable to embrace pluralism and to acknowledge that there are limits to where different parties can agree to something, especially when harm has transpired. And how to respond to harm when it has transpired, or different approaches to responding to harm at different levels, individual, interpersonal, then there's intergroup, intragroup. There's just different degrees of harm and violence that can happen. And so to what extent do we tolerate harm? I think that's a really big question. I think for me personally, I reflect on to what extent, to what extent is cancel culture? I don't even know, that's not even the word that I want to use at all, but I'll just read this quote by James Baldwin because I think it's more appropriate than me trying to rack my brain on how to make cancel culture work. So the quote is, "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." So I do think it's important when atrocious violence and crimes against humanity that put populations at risk of survival, that put ecosystems at risk, we do have to ask ourselves, what is the appropriate response? And I don't think cancellation culture offers us the blueprints, but something isn't working out. Yeah, so I'll just pause there.
Yeah, and I mean, Fela, I think about the word that you used at the beginning of divestment, and like, as you're talking, I have this thought and I get this sense that like, there are these atrocious harms that happen, right? And there's power out there. And I believe that many, many, many people and many people who participate in, quote unquote, cancel culture feel actually very powerless to impact the things that are actually atrocious in the world. And I think that one of the things that can happen psychologically when we don't feel that we have power is we try and exert power in ways that are violent so that we can feel ourselves. And I think that happens a lot, where people who don't feel a level of societal power or the ability to impact the change that they want to see in the world in terms of the violence that is rooted in a fundamental like disbelief of one's humanity or disbelief of the value of humans or of the earth or of whatever. I think that can often really turn inwards towards communities, coming out sideways towards ourselves and the people that we love, who we actually do have the power to influence and affect and impact. And so I think that like, I actually don't even remember what the initial question was because I just thought of this when Paula was talking, but I think that, is what do we lose? Yeah, and so I think that, one of the things that we lose in this is actually our humanity in many ways. Like we actually lose our connection to ourselves as humans. And I think that as part of that, we also lose so much of our capacity and resilience. Because I think of when you know, if the thing is like, I am harmed and the person who harms me must be a villain, then that kind of erases all opportunity for me to engage with my experience of harm relationally, both with myself and with the other person, because I have to be put into this role as like the one who is harmed and the person who is over there. And I'm not talking, of course, about like abuse and other types of really concrete where someone is using their power in an oppressive and violent way. But I'm talking about the types of harms that happen interpersonally all the time, because we are people together and people have things come out sideways together. And I think that what we lose in cancel culture, one of the things is our own sense of our own power, and our own capacity to be in a reparative process with someone. Yeah, and I think that in terms of how to live in a world of duality and juxtaposition, and there's like really appreciating all of the systemic levels, of which there are many, but on a personal and like individual levels, I feel like digging into the places of self-inquiry of like, where do I actually take this like weird, deranged pleasure in exerting my power because I feel powerless in my life? Like actually being willing to look into these corners of ourselves and say like, oh, you know, that person hurt my friend and I want to fucking kill him. And like, that's a part of me. And it's okay that there's a part of me. And also like, how can I contact that bigger part of myself that is still connected to my humanity? And it's maybe connected to my larger value system that says that, and you know, as a therapist, I've worked with people who have killed people, like, and they're human people who I think it's important for me to remember that I am not very far away from that if I was in those life circumstances, I likely would make those same decisions. And I think that as much as possible, people doing their own self-inquiry into finding the places where they really want to distance themselves from the capacity to do harm, and in that distancing are in fact doing harm. I think that those types of self-inquiry are the ways that we actually move towards being able to do what we were all talking about like just have a conversation with someone who is different from us. Yeah, thank you.
I appreciate you bringing it back to the self-inquiry. You know, we've zoomed out a lot and now we're coming back into center. And I would like to read a passage from Adrienne Maree Brown's book, We Will Not Cancel Us, that feels like it kind of sums up a lot of what we've been talking about before we go on to any final thoughts. And this part really spoke to me in preparation for this conversation. And so Adrienne Maree Brown says, I am speaking of the social destruction of call-outs and or cancellations. Call-outs have a long history as a brilliant strategy for marginalized people to stand up to those with power. Call-outs have been a way to bring collective pressure to bear on corporations, institutions, and abusers on behalf of individuals or oppressed people who cannot stop the injustice and get accountability on their own. There are those of alignment with life, consent, dignity, and humanity who will only stop when a light is shined onto their inhumane behavior. But many of the call-outs burning through our movements today don't feel aligned with the lineage of this tactic. Right now, call-outs are being used not just as a necessary consequence for those wielding power to cause harm or enact abuse, but to shame and humiliate people in the wake of misunderstanding, contradictions, conflicts, and mistakes. I want to place my finger on the destructive power of punitive justice currently unleashed in our movements and see how we bring abolition, vision, and skill to the wounds. So with that, I would love to open the floor to y'all on any final words before we go into a little raffle. And if there's time, a Q&A. And if there's no final thoughts, that's also okay. You can just give me a hand signal. Wonderful. Wow. Thank you, Tessa, Paola, and Isaac so much for being here and being a part of this conversation. I know we're getting close to 8 o'clock, so if any of you need to go directly at 8, please do. I'm actually going to pass this over to Sophia, who has a little raffle for the students who are joining. And then if anyone else wants to stay along and have a conversation and debrief, we can keep that open for, another 10, 15 minutes.
And then I was just checking in. Did you see Jess has a question?
Jess asked, who benefits from cancel culture?
I'm happy to take a quick stab at answering that if it's desired. Well, I think that some of the specific historical details that Paula mentioned earlier in the conversation about how communities that are divided are easier to take advantage of, I think that actually is the fundamental answer to that, where it's like, if we are attacking ourselves and kind of cutting ourselves off at the knees, then we are not a united, powerful force for building the world that we want to see. I think that is to me, that's foundationally the answer.
Yeah, I'm going to co-sign on that. I was going to basically jump on the same sort of point that anyone who's trying to divide people benefits from cancel culture. And there's plenty of people out there that you can imagine probably don't necessarily want everyone to be as united as they can be. And I mean, when you look at just social media and Facebook and how you've seen how they actually have studies that show that it's actually divided people, and that people can literally pay these sorts of platforms to run these ads that literally divide people, that there's definitely the only people who benefit from it are probably not benefiting it for the right reasons in any way, unfortunately.
Agreed.
Thank you all for answering that. So like I said, I'm going to pass it back to Sophia for a quick raffle moment. And then if y'all want to stay on, you can, but if not, feel free to leave us.
Thank you, Mariska, and thank you so much for the conversation. It's been very interesting. I feel like there's so much going on in a good way. I've really enjoyed it. But Mariska read a passage from We Will Not Cancel This earlier, and we will be raffling a copy of We Will Not Cancel This, as well as a copy of Generation Rising, A New Politics of Southeast Asian American Activism by Professor Dao. So I actually want to share, I know Mariska read a passage from the book, but I want to read a passage that really spoke to me. And I think it kind of wraps up our conversation as well really nicely. So if you guys have your book by you, it's on page 51. I know Mariska, you have yours. So it's at the very bottom. It's very short. I'll keep it short. It says, I want us to see individual acts of harm as symptoms of systemic harm, and to do what we can do collectively to dismantle the systems and get as many of us free as possible. Often a call out becomes the disease. Often a call out comes because the disease has reached an acute state in someone, as festering and hiding is actively causing harm. I want us to see the difference between the human and the disease, to see what we are afraid of in others and in ourselves, and discern a path that actually addresses the root of our justified fears. So it's amazing. It's super short. So if you don't win, I definitely recommend getting a copy. It has been super eye-opening for me. So I'm just going to do this randomly. So number 3. So I think that is you, Ali. So you're going to be getting a copy. I believe, Sharon, they can just get it from the Center for, I know Ali is a community engagement student, so I don't know if you want me to try again.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
Okay.
Everybody is invited. Every Thursday at 9, we have coffee and pastries. So come by then or come by anytime. But yeah, and just remind me that you won the raffle and you'll get your book.
And then I think I'll do it again for Professor Dao's book. So let's see. So that's number 2. So that's Jacqueline. Sorry if I mispronounced your name, but I believe that's you. So I think I'll pass it off to you again, Mariska, if you want to wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophia. Isaac, Tessa, do you have maybe 5 or 10 minutes if there's any questions that are coming up from people?
Sure.
Wonderful, thanks. So I just want to open the floor. If anyone has a question that they would like to ask our participants, go ahead, raise your hand, let us know, and you can jump in. Jess, do you have a question? That was an applause. Thanks, Jess. All right. Well, oh, we got one from the debate team. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I wanted, and I apologize, I don't remember who was saying this, but one of the speakers was talking about the role as gossip and the way that's really harmful. And I was wondering if you could distinguish between gossip that you see as harmful and whisper networks that are about protecting other folks.
I'm happy to speak to that. Paula was the one who mentioned that, but I'm happy to speak to it in the capacity that I can. I think that whisper networks are are kind of a protective mechanism that come out of imbalanced power. And so when it is not safe to speak to a harm that has happened or to speak to someone who is actively causing harm or acting abusively in communities, either because they have, I actually can't think of a reason other than because they have societal or institutional power, then a whisper network becomes completely necessary for people to be able to hear what's going on. I think that this is different from harmful gossip. And I'll also throw in that I also think that healthy, well-intentioned gossip is wonderful for communities. I don't think that gossip is a blanket slate bad thing personally. But I think that the type of harmful gossip that I believe Paolo was speaking to is ill-intentioned or is coming from that feeling of powerlessness that I was describing that causes people to try and grasp for power by like putting other people down. And I think that it also, a reflection or an example of it is the example that I gave where people are sharing information with the intention to humiliate or, remove people's access to their social support network or whatever that type of thing is, without being willing to actually engage in conversation about what it is that they're doing. If someone is if messages are being passed as indictments, not in good faith, I think that that's the type of really harmful gossip that Paolo was speaking to.
Thank you, that was really helpful.
Thank you, Tessa, for answering that question for us. All right, are there any other questions that people have that have been stirring in their minds or quotes or things they'd like to share? Okay, well then, if not, I would like to thank everyone for coming here this evening. Thank you so much, Sharon, Sabota, for making this possible, for thinking of the theme, the yes and, both and, holding it all and looking beyond cancel culture. This was a really rich conversation. Big thanks to Tessa and Isaac and Paula, who all showed up, and to all of you who stayed throughout all of this. I hope that this felt rich and fulfilling for you all as well, and is having your mind think beyond what we may have originally came to this conversation with on cancel culture, and naming it for what it is and divesting and seeing the power.
And before you all go, I also want to do a shout out to Mariska and Colin and Sophia for curating this really great conversation. And thank you to the panelists and all of you. It was really, really fruitful, and just want to give props to all of you for planning it and making it happen. Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. It was fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Sharon, would you like us to end on anything else or any last final thoughts?
No, thank you all for being here. Are people comfortable? I should have asked earlier. Can we take a quick screenshot before y'all go, whoever's left?
Yeah.
All right. On the count of 3. All right, everyone. Thank you so much and have a great night.
Cool.
Thank
Thanks, y'all.
you.
Thank you.